Welcome back to Animal Quests. Today we're looking at 7 fatal shark encounters where the animal behaved exactly the way its biology predicted it would, and the human involvement made the one decision that changed everything. From an influencer reaching for a feeding tiger shark's tail fin off Oahu, to a hand-feeding stunt in the Bahamas that ended with a hammerhead's own blind spot closing on the wrong target. But first, we begin on the beaches of Queensland, Australia, where a middle-aged couple decided the lifeguards standing directly in front of them didn't know what they were talking about. On December 4th, 2015, on a stretch of coastline along K'gari, Queensland, Warwick Dale, 52, and his wife Rosalind Dale, 49, arrived at their usual swimming spot for what had become an almost yearly ritual. Warwick ran a mid-sized construction company out of Brisbane, and Rosalind worked as a real estate agent specializing in coastal properties. The couple had been coming to this exact stretch of beach for close to 15 years, and in that entire span, neither of them had so much as seen a shark fin from the shore. That streak had quietly become the entire foundation of what they believed about this particular patch of water. That morning, a dead dugong carcass had washed up roughly 2 miles down the coast overnight, and lifeguards on duty had already spotted a large tiger shark circling near the drop-off, feeding intermittently on the carcass and showing no sign of moving on. Red over yellow patrol flags went up at both beach access points, alongside posted beach closure signs well before 9 that morning, well before the Dales had even parked their car. A young lifeguard, no older than 20 by most accounts, approached the couple directly as they carried their towels and gear down toward the sand and explained the closure in specific detail. The shark sighting logged less than an hour earlier. The decision to shut the beach down entirely rather than risk a partial reopening later in the day. Warwick reportedly laughed the warning off, telling the young lifeguard he had been swimming this exact stretch of water longer than the man had been alive, and that beach patrol had a habit of overreacting to a single sighting that would likely amount to nothing by the afternoon. It was 15 years of nothing happening, more than any flag or verbal warning standing in front of him, that had built the confidence Warwick carried straight past the closure that morning. Rosalind followed her husband into the water without objection, later described by a nearby beachgoer as simply trusting her husband's red on a beach they both considered practically their own. I think what's worth sitting with here is that the lifeguard wasn't guessing or padding a routine closure. There was an active shark logged that same morning, a fresh and ongoing food source less than 2 miles away, and a direct, specific verbal warning delivered face to face. That's about as clear as a warning gets in this job, and it still didn't register as real to 2 people who had simply never had a bad day at this beach before. Tiger sharks are known to remain in a localized area for days after locating a reliable food source, patrolling the same stretch of water repeatedly rather than moving on after a single feeding pass, particularly when a carcass continues to provide an easy meal nearby. They are highly opportunistic predators and will investigate any large, moving shape in churned or cloudy water, especially close to an existing carcass site where their guard around unfamiliar objects is already lowered. Their jaws are structured to shear through dense material, including turtle shell and marine mammal blubber, and a single bite from an adult tiger shark can generate enormous force in an instant, more than enough to cause catastrophic damage to a human limb or torso. The couple swam about 40 yards beyond the sandbar, remaining well within sight of the quiet, closed beach behind them. They floated together in calm water, talking as they treaded near a slightly deeper patch where the sandy bottom dropped away into darker water. From the surface, nothing appeared unusual. Based on the evidence gathered afterward, lifeguards concluded that the shark approached without warning. Its first strike hit Rosalind low around the hip and thigh with tremendous force, pulling her beneath the surface before she had any real chance to react or call for help. She resurfaced only moments later, but the extent of her injuries was immediately obvious. Witnesses watching from the dunes above the closed beach later described seeing a dark stain spread quickly through the water around her, revealing just how serious the attack had been within seconds. Warwick swam toward her immediately, the only decision investigators could reasonably reconstruct from the scene that followed, closing the gap between them in a matter of seconds. The shark, having released Rosalind after the initial strike, circled back through the same patch of water within roughly a minute and struck again, this time closer to where Warwick had reached his wife. Based on the pattern of disturbance reported from shore, both strikes occurred within a tight window of 2 to 3 minutes total. Lifeguards on jet skis reached the location within 4 minutes of a beachgoer on the dune, raising the alarm, but by the time they arrived, there was very little left to recover at the surface beyond scattered gear that had drifted loose from the couple. Search teams recovered partial remains over the following 2 days, working in coordination with local marine and police units. Authorities confirmed the tiger shark's presence in the area using drone footage captured that same morning, well before the couple had even reached the sand. The beach remained closed for several days afterward while patrols monitored the area for continued activity. No charges were filed, since nothing about the incident involved anything illegal on anyone's part, but Queensland Lifeguard Services later cited the case directly in beach safety training materials distributed across the region. I think this is genuinely one of the more frustrating cases on this whole list, not because the warning was vague or easy to miss, but because it was about as immediate and specific as a warning can possibly get, and 15 years of good luck still outweighed it in the exact moment it mattered most. While Kagari had claimed the Dales, False Bay, South Africa would soon show how a wetsuit and a surfboard could turn a man into something else entirely once he was seen from below. On September 19, 2014, off the coast of False Bay, South Africa, Corwin Ashfeld, 31, paddled out for what he expected to be a routine morning surf session near Seal Island. Corwin had grown up surfing this coastline and had logged countless sessions there over the better part of a decade, working part-time at a local surf shop in between contract jobs in the city. He understood, at least in theory, that the waters near the island carried genuine risk during the austral winter breaching season, when great whites hunt Cape Fur seals in explosive, vertical strikes launched from directly below the surface. That particular morning, seal activity near the island was unusually high, with dozens of animals entering and exiting the water in tight, splashing groups that could be seen clearly from the shoreline. A marine safety patrol boat had already posted verbal warnings at both of the main paddle-out points along the beach. Corwin heard the patrol's advisory delivered directly to a small cluster of surfers gathered near the water's edge, including a warning that a shark had been sighted breaching near the island less than an hour earlier. He reasoned, based on years of surfing this stretch without so much as a distant fin sighting of his own, that the sharks tended to stay tucked closer to the island itself, and that the distance he intended to paddle out that morning would keep him reasonably clear of any real activity. That same reasoning, years of nothing happening translated into a sense of personal exemption, would end up mattering more than anyone standing on the beach that morning could have possibly guessed. Corwin was dressed head to toe in a black wetsuit against the chill of the winter water, riding a board with a dark-colored deck, and paddled out to a position roughly a half-mile from the island, closer to the breaching activity than he likely realized, where seals continued moving in and out of the water in loose groups around him. Great white sharks hunting seals in False Bay typically strike from directly below in a single explosive vertical breach, aiming for the silhouette of prey backlit against the brighter surface light above. A surfer lying prone on a dark-decked board, wrapped head to toe in a black wetsuit, creates an outline strikingly similar to a seal when viewed from beneath, particularly in the lower visibility water conditions common to the bay during winter months. These attacks are typically a single decisive strike delivered at enormous speed rather than a sustained pursuit, since the shark in these cases isn't hunting the surfer specifically, but reacting instinctively to a shape it briefly misread from below. Investigators reconstructed the incident largely from Corwin's board, which washed ashore later that same day, roughly a mile south of where he'd paddled out, bearing a bite pattern consistent with a large great white, estimated at close to 14 feet in length based on the spacing between individual tooth marks left deep in the fiberglass. The board had been struck once, with enough force to snap it cleanly near the midpoint. No one directly witnessed the shark strike Corwin. The closest person to the incident was a boat captain working roughly 200 yards away. He later described seeing a sudden, violent burst of white water erupt at the surface without any warning. Moments later, Corwin's surfboard was thrown high into the air before crashing back into the sea. Within seconds, the disturbance began to fade.
From that distance, the captain couldn't see exactly what had happened, only that something had gone terribly wrong.
The captain immediately turned his boat toward the location and reached it as quickly as possible. By the time he arrived, however, there was no sign of Corwin anywhere on the surface. The only things left behind were scattered pieces of surfboard foam drifting in the swell and a faint red discoloration spreading through the water. Searchers scanned the area, hoping to find some trace of him, but the ocean had already returned to an eerie calm. The attack itself had lasted only a few seconds, leaving almost nothing behind except the evidence floating on the surface.
I think the part of this one that stands out most is that he wasn't ignorant of the danger in any real sense.
He understood the seal season, understood the general risk near the island, and still made a calculated bet that his distance and his years of experience would be enough to keep him clear of it. That gap between understanding a risk intellectually and actually respecting it in the moment is where most of these stories seem to live. A search and rescue operation continued for the next 2 days as crews searched the surrounding waters for any sign of his body. Despite extensive efforts, the operation ended without a recovery, leaving only the eyewitness accounts and the circumstances of the attack to reconstruct what had happened. happened. Afterwards, the authorities classified the incident as consistent with previous great white shark encounters near the island. Officials also renewed their safety advisories, urging surfers to avoid entering the water near active seal colonies during the peak months when breaching activity is at its highest. While False Bay had claimed Corwin, Sharm el-Sheikh would soon show how quickly a late-night swim could turn fatal once the water itself had already been given a reason to feed. On July 26, 2016, aboard a chartered overnight yacht off Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt's southern Sinai region, Milo Bregman, 27, and Wesley Thorne, 29, were celebrating the final night of a week-long diving trip. Both men worked in finance in London and had been drinking steadily through the evening as the boat sat anchored in open water well beyond the reef line and the relative safety of the shallows they'd spent the week diving. Around midnight, the yacht's kitchen crew cleared out the evening's food waste, dumping several buckets of raw fish scraps directly over the side into the dark water below an outdated practice most modern liveaboard operators have long since abandoned, though a handful of older or budget-run boats in the region were still known to follow it at the time. None of the guests aboard thought to question it. Minutes later, Milo and Wesley, the only two guests still awake, decided to jump from the top deck for a late-night swim together, unaware that the water beneath them had just been given a very specific and very fresh reason to draw something in from deeper offshore. The anchorage was well known among local dive operators for its steep underwater drop-offs located just a short distance from the boat. Those deeper waters were regularly used by pelagic open ocean shark species moving through the area, especially during the night. Once a scent trail entered the current, it could spread quickly through the surrounding water. Marine predators are highly sensitive to these chemical cues and can detect them from considerable distances. That combination of deep water, nighttime conditions, and drifting scent made the anchorage a place where sharks were known to pass through on a regular basis. Oceanic white-tip sharks are wide-ranging deep-water predators known to detect and methodically follow food odors across significant distances, often tracking a scent trail with persistence until they locate its source. Unlike reef-dwelling species that tend to avoid unfamiliar objects, oceanic whitetips show comparatively little hesitation around vessels or swimmers and have been documented making repeated investigative passes at boats directly following food disposal, circling rather than fleeing. These investigative encounters are typically probing bites rather than sustained lethal attacks on multiple people, which is part of what made this particular night so unusual. Crew members reported hearing shouting within minutes of the jump. Based on the account later pieced together by the crew still aboard, the shark made at least one pass at the pair before the first strike landed, hitting Milo first as he swam toward the ladder. Wesley turned back toward his friend rather than continuing to the boat, and the shark circled back within roughly a minute, striking Wesley's leg as he reached Milo's position in the water. Crew members reported the water near the ladder had visibly darkened by the time they got a line out. Milo was pulled from the water unresponsive and could not be revived. Wesley, badly injured but still conscious, was hauled aboard and rushed toward shore, where he underwent emergency surgery and survived, though he lost partial use of the leg. I think the detail that stays with me here is Wesley turning back for his friend instead of finishing the swim to the ladder. A reasonable, almost automatic instinct that put him directly in the shark's path a second time, and one that very nearly cost him his life as well. Later, Egyptian marine authorities opened an investigation into the liveaboard's waste disposal procedures. Investigators examined whether food scraps discarded from the vessel could have contributed to attracting sharks into the area. They also reviewed the sequence of events leading up to the attack and interviewed those involved. Although no single cause could be established with certainty, the investigation highlighted concerns about swimming after recent food disposal. As a result, officials introduced new guidance for liveaboard operators. The updated advice specifically discouraged night swimming near areas where food waste had recently been discarded. Despite the investigation, no criminal charges were brought against the crew. Authorities concluded that the practices being followed at the time did not technically violate any existing regulations. Instead, the incident exposed a gap in the safety guidance rather than evidence of criminal wrongdoing. The new recommendations were intended to reduce the chances of a similar incident occurring in the future. Charter operators were encouraged to revise their procedures accordingly. The case ultimately led to changes in safety advice rather than legal action. While the Red Sea had claimed Milo, Oahu would soon show how a shark already occupied with an easy meal could still turn fatal for someone determined to get closer to it than anyone else. On February 14, 2017, off the north shore of Oahu, Hawaii, Zane Holloway, 26, a content creator who had spent several years building a modest online following filming ocean wildlife encounters, heard that a whale carcass had drifted into shallow water overnight, drawing in several tiger sharks throughout the following day. Word spread quickly through the local diving community, and by early afternoon, Zane had convinced himself this was exactly the footage that would finally push his channel past the plateau it had been stuck at for months. He entered the water alone with a mounted camera rig, swimming toward one of the larger sharks feeding steadily on the carcass, roughly 60 yards offshore. He filmed from a cautious distance at first, circling the scene the same way he'd approached smaller, less dangerous wildlife shots earlier in his career. That caution didn't hold for long. Over the following several minutes, Zane began drifting progressively closer, a habit that had defined his entire filming style for years, always pushing each new shot slightly nearer than the last one that had gotten him views, until he was close enough to attempt grabbing the shark's tail fin for a more dramatic angle shot entirely from behind. Tiger sharks feeding on a carcass are typically far more tolerant of nearby divers than they would be under ordinary circumstances, since their attention remains locked almost entirely on the food source rather than on potential threats nearby. However, a lowering of the pectoral fins close to the body is a well-documented pre-strike posture in sharks generally, often signaling agitation or an impending defensive reaction, particularly when an animal feels crowded, cornered, or physically touched while it is actively feeding. According to the divers filming from a safer distance, Zane approached the shark from directly behind and made contact near its tail. The shark's pectoral fins had visibly dropped against its body in the moments beforehand, a detail the other divers only recognized in hindsight while reviewing their own footage afterward. The animal turned rapidly in the water the instant contact was made, and witnesses described a brief, violent thrash before Zane went under. The shark appeared to release Zane after the initial attack, giving the impression that the encounter might be over, but only seconds later, as he tried to swim away, it turned and came back. Witnesses described the second strike as shorter than the first, but it left him with even more serious injuries. The entire encounter unfolded in just a matter of moments. Those nearby could do little except react as quickly as possible. By the time the shark disappeared, Zane had been critically wounded. The divers immediately reached him and began pulling him toward a nearby boat. They worked as fast as they could while trying to keep him above the surface and stop the bleeding. Once aboard, they rushed back toward shore in the hope of getting him emergency medical care. Despite those efforts, the injuries he had suffered were too severe. Zane did not survive the journey back. His death marked the end of an attack that had lasted only seconds but changed everything. I think there's a very specific kind of overconfidence that builds up from watching enough shark footage online and assuming you can read an animal's warning signs in real time from experience alone. By the other divers' own accounts, the shark's posture had already changed noticeably before Zane made his final approach toward it, and nobody in the water recognized it in that moment. Authorities investigated the incident and confirmed tiger shark involvement based on witness statements and the carcass's continued presence in the area over the following several days. Officials reiterated existing guidance strongly discouraging divers from approaching sharks actively feeding on marine mammal remains under any circumstances. While Oahu had claimed Zane, the Great Barrier Reef would soon show how something as small as where a spear fisherman clips his catch could turn a routine dive fatal. On May 3, 2018, along the outer reef systems of Australia's Great Barrier Reef, Corbin Wexler, 34, an experienced spear fisherman, was diving with two others, Declan Fair, 36, and a third, less experienced diver the group generally left unnamed in later reports. All three had spent the morning spearing reef fish, and Corbin and Declan had both fallen into the same habit over the years, clipping their catch directly onto their weight belts rather than sending it up on a float line, a shortcut both men had gotten away with for years without consequence. By early afternoon, visibility in the water had dropped noticeably from churned sediment, and both Corbin and Declan were still swimming with bleeding fish clipped at their hips, trailing blood and vibration through the murky water around the reef structure. Bronze whaler sharks are known to be drawn efficiently and quickly to blood and vibration, and are considered among the more assertive species around active spearfishing, frequently approaching divers carrying catch directly on their person rather than at a safer distance on a float. Fatal attacks from bronze whalers remain extremely rare, which is part of why what followed stood out so sharply to investigators afterward. The third diver, who was swimming a short distance away from the other two, later described seeing a shark emerge suddenly from the murky water and strike Corbin low around the hip. As Declan immediately moved in to help pull his friend toward the surface, another attack followed within seconds, this one catching Declan across the forearm. Investigators could never determine whether it was the same shark returning or a second shark drawn in by the blood in the water. The third diver, who was not carrying any catch on his belt, was never approached by the shark. He managed to get both men to the boat and raise the alarm. Corbin's injuries proved too severe, and he did not survive the journey back. Declan, though badly hurt, made it to shore in time for emergency surgery and pulled through, becoming one of the rare survivors of a bronze whaler encounter that had already turned fatal for someone else in the water beside him. The tragedy left investigators unable to determine with certainty whether one shark or two had been involved in the attacks. What they could confirm was that both encounters occurred within moments of each other, giving rescuers almost no time to intervene. The speed of the attacks became one of the defining features of the case.
I think this is the version of the mistake that really shows how it compounds.
One diver clipping fish to his belt is a bad habit, but two divers doing it side by side in low visibility turned a single shark encounter into something that very nearly took both of them. Afterwards, Queensland fisheries authorities cited the case when updating their spearfishing safety guidance. The revised materials placed renewed emphasis on the use of float lines around reef systems known for regular bronze whaler shark activity. Officials explained that keeping caught fish away from a diver's body could help reduce the risk of attracting sharks. The recommendations were directed at both experienced and recreational spearfishers. They also encouraged divers to remain aware of local shark behavior before entering the water. The case became an example used to reinforce these safety practices. Its lessons continue to be referenced in shark risk awareness programs across the region.
While the Great Barrier Reef had claimed Corbin, San Diego would soon show how one of the ocean's fastest predators could turn a routine fishing trip fatal within seconds.
On August 11, 2019, roughly 2 miles off the coast of San Diego, California, Garrison Voss, 41, a recreational angler with years of offshore fishing experience under his belt, was targeting yellowtail from an inflatable paddleboard, a setup he had used successfully dozens of times before in calmer conditions closer to shore. That afternoon, something far larger than anything he had hooked previously struck his line hard, nearly pulling the rod from his hands, and Garrison found himself connected to an animal he had no realistic way of landing safely from where he sat. Instead of cutting the line once it became clear that he had hooked a large shortfin mako, Garrison continued fighting the fish. Even from a distance, the shark had been seen breaching above the surface, making its size obvious. Rather than releasing it, he spent several minutes gradually reeling it closer to his paddleboard. It was a decision shaped by experience rather than recklessness. Landing hooked fish had been part of his routine for years. On larger, more stable boats, that approach had served him well. A paddleboard, however, offered far less stability and almost no protection once a powerful shark was brought close. As the distance between Garrison and the thrashing animal narrowed, the situation became increasingly dangerous. What had worked safely on sturdier vessels did not translate to such a small watercraft. The same instinct that had helped him land countless fish in the past placed him in an entirely different kind of risk that day. Shortfin makos are widely regarded as the fastest species of shark in the ocean, capable of bursts exceeding 40 miles per hour in open water and vertical leaps well over 20 feet into the air when hooked or otherwise agitated. Their aggressive fighting behavior once hooked is extremely well documented among offshore anglers worldwide, and wildlife agencies specifically advise cutting the line immediately if a hooked mako is brought too close to a small or unstable vessel, given the animal's well-known tendency to breach violently and directly at the exact source of tension on the line. A nearby boater, whose account was later used to reconstruct much of the incident, reported watching the mako breach twice in quick succession as it closed the remaining distance to the paddleboard, the second leap bringing it directly alongside Garrison before he could react. The board flipped in the disturbance, throwing Garrison into the water, still tangled in the line. The shark was still hooked and thrashing violently at the surface only a few feet from the boat when Garrison entered the water. Investigators later determined that it struck him either during the fall or in the moments immediately afterward. The available evidence could not establish the exact sequence of events with certainty. Everything unfolded in just a matter of seconds. Those nearby had almost no time to react before the attack was over. The chaos at the surface made it impossible for witnesses to piece together every detail. A nearby boater saw the emergency and reached the area within only a few minutes. By the time help arrived, however, Garrison had already suffered catastrophic injuries. Rescuers did everything they could after pulling him from the water. Despite their efforts, there was nothing they could do to save him. He was pronounced dead as a result of the injuries sustained during the attack. The incident remains one of the rare cases involving a hooked shark striking someone at such close range. I think the moment to cut that line was obvious in hindsight to nearly every experienced angler who heard about this case afterward.
And Garrison, by all accounts, a skilled and normally cautious fisherman, simply didn't take it once the fish was already thrashing that close to him.
Following the incident, California wildlife officials investigated the attack and confirmed that a shortfin mako shark had been involved based on the recovered fishing tackle and the boater's first-hand account. They also reiterated existing safety guidance for anglers targeting large pelagic species from paddleboards and other small, unstable watercraft. Officials noted that fighting powerful sharks from such vessels can significantly increase the risk of falling falling into the water. The case was later referenced as a reminder of those dangers. Anglers were encouraged to use appropriate equipment and remain aware of the risks when pursuing large offshore fish. The incident reinforced safety advice that had already been in place for years.
While San Diego had claimed garrison, Bimini would soon show how something as simple as a closed fist could turn a routine hammerhead encounter fatal.
On April 22, 2020, in the shallow waters off Bimini in the Bahamas, Dash Renner, 29, and his diving partner, Corin Ashby, 27, had traveled to the island together specifically for its reputation as one of the more reliable places to encounter great hammerheads up close in clear, shallow water. Local dive operators typically handled feeding interactions using long poles, deliberately keeping bait clear of the body to avoid exactly the kind of misjudged strike hammerheads are known for. Wanting a closer, more personal interaction than the standard guided dive offered, Dash and Corin both entered the shallows separately from the group, each carrying a small piece of fish in a closed fist, rather than using the feeding tools available on the boat, a decision they'd apparently made together after discussing it the night before. A 10-foot hammerhead, accustomed to divers feeding in the area over previous weeks, approached the pair directly. Great hammerhead sharks have their eyes positioned at the far outer edges of their distinctively shaped heads, leaving a blind spot directly in front of the snout. Researchers generally agree this blind spot is only one contributing factor in feeding-related bites, and rarely the primary one. Excitement, competition over the food source, rapid prey movement, and simply poor visual resolution at close range are considered more significant drivers of a misjudged strike than the blind spot alone. According to a third diver who was watching from a short distance away, the shark approached Dash first as he was handling the bait. Investigators believe the animal, driven by a combination of excitement and the close, fast movement of the handheld bait, misjudged its final approach and closed its jaws on his forearm instead of the bait. The attack happened without warning and lasted only a moment. Dash immediately struggled to pull away from the shark. Blood quickly spread through the water as the animal released him. Seeing what had happened, Corin immediately swam toward Dash to help pull him back to safety. As she reached him, the shark turned and struck again, catching her calf before disappearing into deeper water. The third diver moved in as quickly as possible and managed to reach both of them, pulling the injured pair back toward the waiting boat. Dash's injuries were catastrophic, and despite first aid on the return journey, he did not survive. Corin, though seriously injured, made it back in time for emergency treatment and survived a rare outcome that reflects how uncommon fatal attacks from great hammerheads actually are compared to species like tigers, bulls, or great whites. I think this is the one that really shows how a single hammerhead's excitement around a handheld food source doesn't stop being a problem after the first strike.
It's just as likely to misjudge the second person who swims in to help as it was the first.
Later, Bahamian marine authorities investigated the attack and concluded that it was broadly consistent with documented hammerhead feeding behavior, though they noted the blind spot was likely only one factor among several. Following the investigation, local dive operators reinforced their safety protocols by prohibiting all hand feeding during shark dives and requiring the use of pole-based feeding tools for future guided encounters, reducing the need for divers to place their hands close to a shark's mouth.